Welcome again, Yehonatan Pollard. Looking at the numerous comments below these discussions between Yehonatan and Machon Shilo's Rabbi David Bar-Hayim, I take pleasure in noting that many viewers derive great benefit from them, and quite a few have expressed their desire to see Yehonatan ascend to a position of real power. B'ezrat Hashem, may we soon hear tidings of peace and Jewish victory. Rabbi Bar-Hayim.
Shalom to you, Jonathan Pollard,
Shalom.
And to all our viewers. Last week, Henry Kissinger died, and I would like to begin with a discussion regarding his approach and his actions during the course of the second half, essentially, of the 20th century. And this discussion, I would like to divide into two parts. First of all, it needs to be stated that he is revered by some as a great genius and a towering intellectual with tremendous achievements as a diplomat and Secretary of State. He's also, on the other hand, reviled by many for various reasons. I can mention the fact that there is a book by Christopher Hitchens entitled The Trial of Henry Kissinger, which wishes to demonstrate that the man was a war criminal on a massive scale. On the other hand, you have many books that laud him and wax eloquent about his achievements. There's also another book that I saw called Kissinger's Betrayal, How America Lost the Vietnam War by Stephen B. Young. So clearly there is a spectrum of opinion regarding this individual. But again, let us discuss this matter and divide it into two parts. First of all, his actions vis-a-vis the Jewish people and the results and outcomes of those actions and policies of Henry Kissinger vis-a-vis the Jewish people. And then we can discuss more generally his impact on the world, whether he was a force for good or something else. So your comments, please.
Thank you. It's good to be with you again. From the historical standpoint, Kissinger was a towering figure in the world of historiography, particularly the Metternich era or system. And it's a particularly interesting era in history. This is the post-Napoleonic era in Europe, where you had a new concert of Europe, as it was called, formed primarily by Prince Metternich of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And Kissinger's analysis or assessment of this era was brilliant, accurate, and interesting. However, what he kind of failed to understand was the system that he understood very well was a system of partners and equals, whether it was Bourbon France, the restoration in France of the Bourbons, the monarchy, the Prussians, the Hohenzollerns, the Habsburgs in Austria-Hungary, the Romanovs in Russia. All of these countries, monarchical countries, had something in common. And so there was peace, for the most part, in Europe because of this concert of Europe that Metternich was able to put together. It ultimately fell apart in 1848 under the pressure of revolution, Europe-wide revolution. So while Kissinger understood the system, this balance of power system that existed, what he failed to understand was all of these countries that Metternich held in balance were basically, they had the same perspective on both maintaining their rule and maintaining their proper distance from their neighbors. Why is this relevant? Because if you look at his conduct later, whether it's in the Middle East or with the opening to China or with the end of Vietnam, he really didn't understand, I think, the fact that we were dealing with a different system. It wasn't a balance of power. It wasn't a concert of Europe, of like-minded regimes. It was something very different. And so you had a situation with Vietnam where, because of his behavior during the Paris peace talks, the United States shamefully betrayed a very vulnerable ally at the time, which was the Republic of South Vietnam. And he didn't have any problem betraying them and pulling our forces out, despite the fact that thousands upon thousands of US troops died in the interim between the agreement and our final withdrawal, US withdrawal. He didn't care. And he didn't care about the POWs that we left behind either, or the MIAs for that matter. It was cold-blooded. As far as the opening to China was concerned, brilliant, no question. But again, he opened the door on a misinterpretation of China's intentions. He felt that the Chinese wanted to become part of the Western economic system, which they didn't. They basically wanted to take advantage of it for their own purposes. And we're living with the consequences of that short-sightedness, Kissinger's short-sightedness today. As far as the Jewish people were concerned, probably there are two instances that we have to keep in mind. And I'm basing my statements right now on fact, not supposition. His behavior was egregious. He misled Israel in the days, in the weeks and months leading up to the Yom Kippur War, that in fact he claimed there was no war. He more or less agreed with Sadat's view that Israel had to be humbled, bloodied, in order to reach some accommodation with the Arabs. Right when war was recognized as a certain eventuality by the Israelis, he threatened them that should they preempt the Egyptians and the Syrians, there would be no help from the United States forthcoming, either materially or diplomatically. And so the decision was made, primarily by Golda Meir, that we would be on the receiving end. That resulted in nearly 3,000 dead Israeli soldiers, and their blood was on Kissinger's hands. During the war itself, he delayed, if not prevented, at first, the resupply of Israel. And while there are many explanations or stories as to why the United States suddenly woke up to the need to resupply Israel, the fact of the matter was he delayed it until saner heads prevailed. As far as the Jewish community in general was concerned, I think what was most shocking of all was the realization that, or the confirmation, that he did in fact say and believe that even if the Soviet Union were to commit genocide on a scale of the Khurban against the Soviet Jewish community, it would not represent something that threatened or compromised U.S. national security.
I'd just like to quote a source for what you just mentioned. This is quoted on Wikipedia on Henry Kissinger, and footnote 119 quotes from the New York Times. The original was written by Adam Naguni on the 10th of December 2010, an article entitled "In Tapes, Nixon Rails About Jews and Blacks." In this article, it says as follows: that on the first it says as follows: in conversation with Nixon shortly after a meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir on the 1st of March 1973, which it should be noted is several months before the Yom Kippur War, Kissinger stated, the emigration of Jews from the Soviet Union is not an objective of American foreign policy, and if they put Jews into gas chambers in the Soviet Union, it is not an American concern.
Correct.
Maybe, he adds interestingly the word maybe, he qualifies it, maybe a humanitarian concern. Only
Charming.
maybe. Only maybe.
Maybe. Charming.
That is a statement made by Kissinger according to the New York Times. You can either believe them or choose not to disbelieve them, but apparently it's well documented.
I mean, as far as the statement that was quoted in the New York Times is concerned, yes, it's a tape. I mean, it's not really open to speculation or question. Right. And because of the egregious nature of what he said, when I heard that he had died, I turned to my wife, Rivka, and I said, I really wonder if the devil himself will admit him through the gates of hell, because he kind of makes the devil look good. So I'm not of two minds of Kissinger. Yes, I see him from the perspective of a Jew, and I see him through the eyes of an Israeli. And from both perspectives, I don't think very highly of him at all. Even his most famous diplomatic achievement, the opening of China, and the alliance between the United States and China in opposition to Soviet Russia, even that he really misinterpreted in terms of what China's ulterior aims were. It was a classic mistake made by somebody who was steeped in Metternichian logic, which is we're all on the same side, basically. We're all friends, basically, and we just have to kind of maneuver around this Cold War problem, just like Metternich did amongst the Prussians and the Romanovs and the Tsar and the Bourbons in France. This was very different, though, the situation that Kissinger found himself in.
In other words, allow me just to state that, if I understand you correctly, what you are saying is as follows, and this has always been my perception of not only of Kissinger, but of many, many people in the West, that he perceived that all these various nations and superpowers, such as China, are part of this great game of monopoly or risk, or whatever game or you wish to refer to. Mm-hmm. We're all on the same playing board, and we all agree on most things. However, we have different interests, and somehow those interests need to be balanced, and therefore we have to find some modus vivendi.
Correct.
However, if you perceive correctly that China, for example, is not playing on the same board by the same rules and with the same set of values or concepts at all, it's a totally different and foreign civilization, just as Islam is a totally foreign and different civilization, then you understand that negotiation and discussing interests and believing that if you improve, for example, the economic conditions of this or that Islamic nation, that you will appease them and cause them to join your family of nations.
Correct.
This is a complete and utter misconception and extremely naive, and not to mention pernicious in the extreme.
Well, again, you have to look at what he understood. Professionally, he understood the Concert of Europe as arranged or created by Prince Metternich of Austria-Hungary. And that Concert of Europe bore absolutely no resemblance whatsoever, as you just pointed out, to the reality of Kissinger's world. whether it was China or the Middle East, the search for common ground was so short-sighted on his part. He didn't understand culturally that the Muslim world and the Chinese world were fundamentally at odds with the West. And for somebody who understood Prince Metternich and his system, this really wasn't apparent. Yeah, if you really think about realpolitik later in European history, this would have prepared somebody to understand that there are fundamental differences, cultural differences, that can't be rearranged on a level playing field, where you're trying to balance one force off against another. You're dealing with, in the case of the Muslim world and the Chinese world, fundamentally alien and antagonistic civilizations to the West. And this was something that Kissinger just, unfortunately, never picked up on. Why? He wasn't skilled in Middle East politics, and he really didn't know anything at all about Chinese politics or geopolitics. He just grafted his understanding or imposed his understanding of international relations on these two societies. And, well, we see where we ended up, both in the Middle East and with China.
And the peace treaty, the peace accord that he and a certain Vietnamese diplomat, whose name I fear I cannot pronounce correctly, they were both awarded the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah.
For the peace accord in Vietnam, which, of course, in short order collapsed.
Was violated, collapsed.
Why? Because it was never the intention of the North Vietnamese, who were, of course, the agents of the Chinese and in general of Asian civilization, which is entirely antithetical to European and American civilization. It was never their intention to achieve a peace. It was just one more move in order to weaken the enemy and to convince America to pull out so they could complete their conquest of Vietnam.
That situation is something I always point to when people, question why I don't trust the United States. Fundamentally, I don't. And it's because, I was a mature adult at the time of the Paris Peace Accords. I was en route to Vietnam at one point, in fact, never made it. But so watching what happened during that time really left me with an awful feeling towards Kissinger. To call him cynical would be an understatement. The man, I don't believe, was immoral. I believe he was amoral. And if you look at his behavior during the war in East Pakistan, which is now Bangladesh, there was a document called the Blood Telegram, in which Kissinger knew very well what the Pakistani army, the murder and massacres that the Pakistani army was committing in East Pakistan against the local, well, they were Bengali Muslims. And he didn't care. He didn't care at all. And he advised his diplomats to that end. Don't do anything to compromise Pakistan's hold on East Pakistan. From a balance of power perspective, with India more or less allied with the Soviets at the time, you could make a case for his cynicism, but you couldn't make a case at all for his amorality in the face of real genocide, attempted genocide. And that was something that also really bothered me a lot, his kind of calculated indifference towards the potential genocide of an entire people for balance of power reasons. In this particular case, it was just short-sighted. And I think it informed me as far as his later statements with regard to the Jewish community in the Soviet Union and how, their potential demise, collective demise, really wouldn't concern American national security interests. Humanitarian interests, well, yeah, fine.
Maybe.
But maybe. That was one of the interesting things. Maybe.
He's also quoted in that same Wikipedia article as having said that he had a negative view of American Jews who lobbied for aid to Soviet Jews, calling them bastards and self-serving.
A lot of that had to do with his self-hatred.
Here you forced me now to quote one more last quote from the Wikipedia article, which is a quote from the foreword, originally published November 30th, if I'm not mistaken, 2023, by Benjamin Ivry.
Mm-hmm.
And the quote is as follows: If it were not for the accident of my birth, I would be anti-Semitic.
There you go.
And any people who has been persecuted for 2,000 years must be doing something wrong.
Yeah, that's another classic. I don't know what Freud would have to say about it, but I know what Jonathan Pollard had to say about that.
You have there the classic self-hating Jew.
Correct. He ran into a classmate of his at one point, who approached him and this guy tried to start up a conversation with him about old times in Nazi Germany. And Kissinger said, I don't know who you are. I don't know what you're talking about. All this pain and suffering you're talking, I don't recall any of that. And his former friend walked away absolutely convinced that he was suffering from some kind of psychosis. I think that the term self-hatred doesn't do justice to the degree of confusion that played out in his mind. Very dangerous confusion, where he could sit back and actually accept the death of thousands and thousands of Israeli soldiers, for example, with equanimity. He didn't care. They were just pawns on a chessboard that he was manipulating. And very confused man, confused man.
So to sum up briefly what we've said thus far, with regards to his famous opening to China, you state plainly that it was short-sighted, that in the short term, it may have been to America's advantage as to act as a counterweight to the Soviet Union. We're talking about the early 70s.
Correct.
But this did not take into account the long-term impact on both America's position in the world and the world in general.
Correct.
That China would become the new focal point of evil and
anti-Americanism
and a totally antithetical civilization to the West, which purportedly Kissinger was interested in serving.
Correct.
With regards to Vietnam, we agreed about much the same, that he negotiated an accord which was supposed to bring about some kind of armistice and peace, but in fact did nothing of the sort. He was even awarded a
Nobel Prize.
Many people consider it to be bogus. It was in fact very much contested at the time. This is well documented. It was very much contested at the time, including people resigning from the committee that awards the Nobel Peace Prize, and it proved in short term to be a total failure. So, with regards to those two policies of his, he seems not have been very successful. Would you think that there is some area of his diplomatic career that could be described as successful?
The only thing that if I stretched my definition of success, the relationship that eventually developed between Sadat's Egypt and Israel, which he had nothing to do with. It was really between Sadat himself and Menachem Begin. This was really with Camp David, for example, which resulted in Camp David. Did he push that? Yes. His motives for doing so had more to do with the Cold War and ensuring that Russia never gained a foothold in Egypt again than it did an understanding of the dangers of assuming that a real peace could be constructed between Egypt and Israel, a peace that we still haven't realized, in fact. But I think that would come closest to being a partial success as far as Kissinger was concerned.
From his position, perhaps, but not from
No.
Jewish perspective.
No, not at all.
Because
I'm trying to come up with some
redeeming
right
future.
Yeah.
I for one would claim that all the treaties and all the concessions to the Egyptians made by Israel will prove to have been an immense blunder and miscalculation, because I have no doubt that the day will come, and it may not be too far in the future, that the Egyptians will, with the largest army in the Middle East, will attack Israel. Because the only reason they haven't done so up to this point is because it wasn't to their advantage.
I was, in all honesty, totally opposed to Camp David, because I didn't trust the Egyptians then, and I certainly don't trust them now. Look, Egypt's war plans and their military have all been structured with Israel in mind, period. Their most probable enemy, as we say in war planning, is clearly defined as Israel. Certainly, if you look at the situation with Gaza right now, the question is, could the Egyptians have prevented arms and equipment, other equipment, from coming into Hamas-controlled Egypt? And on the other hand, could they have controlled Hamas terrorists from leaving Gaza and being trained in Iran and returned to Gaza? And the answer is yes. They knew exactly what was going on. And so why were they doing that? Because it's in Egypt's interest to have a running sore, a cancer, if you will, on Israel's western flank in the south. The Egyptians have a war plan, which is, they publicized it, where we would be more or less focused on this problem in Gaza while the Egyptian army surged into Sinai. They wanted us on the horns of a dilemma, more or less, between a rocket arsenal in Gaza, threatening basically Israel up to and including Tel Aviv, which we see now, and this massive mechanized Egyptian, care of the Americans, mechanized army surging into Sinai, threatening the Negev. Nobody that I've discussed this with thinks that my assessment is wrong. I mean, how can it be? It's what the Egyptians themselves have stated. If you look right now at this condition in Egypt, the situation in Egypt, it's a volcano waiting to erupt. From an economic standpoint, it's a complete disaster. And if you couple that with all the climate change problems that are occurring in Egypt, mostly relating to sea level rise and the destruction of the Nile Delta breadbasket and the push of salt water up the Nile, destroying the agricultural areas along the northern Nile, or lower Nile as they call it, you're looking at a very, very explosive situation. And in situations like this, it's common for a dictator, which is what Sisi is, to look for an external outlet for popular rage. This is why, in all of my studies of war planning, I always see the Egyptians as, more so than even the Iranians, as our most probable threat that we have to be concerned about. So, unfortunately, our own people in Israel, both in the military and in the political realm, have done nothing to educate the Israeli people as to the actual threat posed by Egypt. If Egypt were really interested in being even a cold ally, they would have made sure that no equipment, no trainers, nothing, the terrorist trainers from Iran mostly, got into Gaza. But they didn't do that. They just didn't. And if they were truly interested, as I said, in being helpful, they certainly wouldn't have allowed Hamas and Palestinian and Islamic Jihad terrorists from leaving Gaza, being trained in Iran, and then returned. So Egypt is playing maybe not a double game, but a triple game. And again, if you look at their war plans, what do they need a massive conventional army for? There is nothing to the south in Sudan that really threatens them. To the west, in Egypt, in Libya, it's a civil war. It's complete anarchy. There's no conventional threat.
It's a failed state.
It's a totally failed. It's beyond even Somalia, if that's possible to believe. So why does Egypt need this massive conventional army? Even for domestic control, you don't need it. There are other things you can use for maintaining domestic control. But he's got an army, built-up army, and Mubarak was part of this as well, that is designed for one thing and one thing alone, and that is a war against Israel at a time and place of their choosing. So where does Gaza fit in all of this? To the extent that they allowed Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad to become the threat that they are now, it's a diversion for our resources and our focus. And in the event, God forbid, of war, it basically siphons off a substantial number of troops, our troops, that would otherwise be quite useful in handling this Egyptian conventional army that suddenly just exploded into Sinai. So the Egyptians, Kissinger's understanding of, here it is again, Kissinger's understanding of Egypt, just like his understanding of China, was fundamentally flawed, period. He understood that buying Egypt's agreement to Camp David, to an agreement with Israel, was fundamentally flawed. It was based on military equipment. If, for example, the Americans had argued that what Egypt needed was economic help rather than military resupply, then I would say, okay, they got it right. But they didn't, because, for one reason or another, the military support that was eventually flowing to Egypt to this very day, again, is just corporate welfare for the American military-industrial complex. That's all. So everything that he thought about ultimately was wrong, dead wrong.